got a lot of professional certifications. You can see them on the agenda on the slide. It's a lot of hard work to get all those certifications. She's an Agile and Project Management Office solution leader at Apex Systems. She's based on the East Coast. I think you're in North Carolina, right, Rachel? That's where Apex is.
Yeah, Apex is actually, we have a presence all across the US. Our headquarters is in Richmond, Virginia. But yep, I am
Okay.
in Charlotte, North Carolina.
And Rachel has a tremendous amount of experience with agile transformation, being very analytical, doing a lot of work organizationally and with executives, and executing things to completion using systems thinking, which we've had prior sessions on that and what systems thinking is. And she drives best practice implementation, influences the adoption of the agile mindset at all levels. There's going to be a unique spin on tonight's session, and that is with diversity, equity, and inclusion, things to think about that we need to think about in our practice and our vocabulary in this environment where DEI is so pervasive and so important. So I think I've said enough at this point. I'm going to turn it over to you, Rachel, for the presentation. Thank you for volunteering your time and looking forward to it.
Thanks, Bob. Thank you, Steve. Thanks, everyone from the Sacramento chapter of the IIBA for having me tonight. I am very honored to be here and also very excited. And thank you also to Vu for your endorsement of this topic, which I agree is also very important for us to be talking about and having an open conversation. I think that a lot of times we might take for granted the vocabulary that we use. So what I'm going to encourage all of us to do tonight is really take a hard look at, some of this terminology that might have been around or been in use for a really long time, but it doesn't necessarily fit in today's day and age. I hope that what you'll see is that sometimes the vocabulary that we choose, it might be interpreted both consciously and subconsciously in a way that we don't intend. And so we can choose our words and really have an impact not only to our business and its bottom line, and I'll spend some time telling you how this actually does contribute to that, but also just to the quality of our personal relationships. So I really hope that you come away from this session with perhaps a new way of thinking about certain terminologies, and that maybe you'll have some ideas of things that you can start to incorporate into your day-to-day vocabulary right away. But first, before we get into the good stuff, I really want to know from all of you, where are you from? And how do you say hello? So we're talking about diversity. I'm sure many of you are joining from various places. Maybe you are also not native to the United States. Maybe you have family or you yourself speak a different language. I would love to know, where are you from and how do you say hello if you want to share it in the chat. Starting to see some come in. We got Canada, we've got California. Very good. Say howdy. I am originally from the state of New York, so we typically say hello. My family is of Italian heritage, so in Italian, when we say hello, we say ciao. I see Diana also says ciao sometimes. Buen dia. Very good. Excellent. All right, well, glad to have you all here, and we'll keep it moving. So next up, what I want to talk about is a little bit about me. Bob already gave a nice overview of my professional bio, so I'm not going to spend any time on that, but I really want to spend a little bit of time talking about how I self-identify. And I think that this is important for a couple of reasons. Number one, when we share how we self-identify with others, it opens the door to give a certain comfort level to have that conversation. it shows that we can be vulnerable and that we can have open dialogue about who we are. And so I self-identify as a cisgendered, straight, Caucasian female or woman, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. With this, I recognize that I do have a certain amount of privilege being Caucasian, and even sometimes to a certain extent, just self-identifying as female. And I do not claim to be an expert on all things DEI. I also recognize that I cannot be the voice for many people. I cannot say that I am an expert in their experiences or things that they might go through, or even the way that they might perceive the vocabulary that we use and that we encounter in our day-to-day. I recognize that. And therefore, I wanted to share with you all that when I was working on this concept of, how can we adapt our vocabulary to be more inclusive, I knew I had to get some help and I had to get many different opinions and perspectives. And so I reached out within Apex to our many ERGs, employee resource groups. You see 6 listed here that I specifically worked with just because as we get into the conversation today, this is really where the areas of vocabulary will affect or touch upon. We also have other ERGs that didn't necessarily come into play here, but I want to give recognition to the people who provided their voice and also helped me learn, because we're always learning and we can always improve. And truly, I hope that by having this conversation, I can at least help be an ally for everyone who contributed, and also for those who are not here or who might be here, and know that we are consciously always striving to do better. So thank you to everyone who did help with this presentation. All right, now I'm gonna move into, let's talk about Agile. Let's talk about the Agile manifesto a little bit. So this is where we're really gonna hit the road. So Agile is actually one of the perspectives considered by the BA-BOK. And if you also want to attribute this conversation to one of the knowledge areas, I think it fits really well with the elicitation and collaboration knowledge area, just because we're really covering an essential soft skill, which is how we communicate with others through our words. So I wanted to bring up the Agile Manifesto, because this is really one of the, I guess, foundational documents that speaks to what are the values that we as Agile practitioners and also others within this realm of this way of working really espouse. What do we think is valuable in our day-to-day working lives and also personal lives? So a bunch of folks got together back in 2001 and they came up with this list of values. And what you'll notice is there are 8 total values. I'm sorry, yes, 8. And on the left, we see that they have labeled this grouping of 4 as more valuable than those on the right. So what they are intending to say is that while we do value all of these things, if we had to prioritize, and oftentimes we do have to prioritize in our personal and professional lives too, we value these things over those. And so what I really want us to focus on tonight is, from this manifesto of this list of values, there's one in particular that really stands out to me as also relevant to our conversation about diversity and inclusion. And I haven't read through them yet, but I'm just curious if anyone might already have an inkling of which one that might be.
Individuals and interactions.
Yeah, definitely. That's the one I'm looking at too. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools, meaning we really care about the people and the interactions that we have more than we actually care about maybe following a process or a tool. So putting people first, putting our relationships first before anything else. And it's the very first one listed as well, you'll notice. So with that being said, I also want to ask you to maybe ponder this question. If it's true that this is perhaps the first value, why then do we sometimes find it so difficult to change our vernacular, or really our vocabulary, the words that we use on a regular basis? Why? Why is it so hard? I know I struggle with this. I am frequently trying to retrain myself to use different vocabulary, and I'll point out which ones as we go through this today. But anyone have any ideas of why sometimes it can be hard to just change these habits, especially around the words that we use?
Me, to me, like one of the things I think about is it's just a direct from think to speak, because this is our language, English, we talk about it first. Now, if we're speaking a foreign language, sometimes you think in your native language and then you translate.
Very
So you have
true.
that little step in between. And maybe you filter. And we don't really filter what we say. We are taught to maybe just react quickly on things.
That's right.
And it's what was ingrained, what we grew up with. So the world's changed, and you know, like they said, everything I needed to know I learned in kindergarten, right? So once it's programmed in, sometimes it's hard to change.
So true. I think you touched on a lot of different elements there, Bob, and those were some of the things I was thinking about too. It's change is hard, and it looks like Cameron also said that in the chat. Thanks, Cameron. Indeed, it is. It is hard to change, and it's also sometimes so ingrained within us that we may not even recognize the words that we use, and how they may be perceived as non-inclusive. These are just long-standing mentalities that we've grown up with. And also, I think you'll find that a lot of literature doesn't necessarily keep up with the times. Like, we are living in a society where things change and move so quickly that it can be difficult sometimes to stay on top of, okay, what's this now? What do I need to know? And so we may be perhaps using vocabulary without realizing that it could be damaging. Diana, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, hi. Just so I also teach English as a second language to professionals. And to your point, it's as native speakers, we get comfortable with our own vocabulary reams. And so unless we're doing literature, English can continue to have to look at these thesaurus and understand new meanings and understand that vocabulary. So as you mentioned, there's so many other aspects vying for our attention of knowledge that it's easy for us native speakers to reduce our own depth from our own language because it is like another language, but it's our own language. It's the most diverse language in the world. So thank you.
So true. And I love hearing that you teach ESL to professionals. I also used to do that in a past life, and met a lot of great people that way. Very cool. So yeah, so I think with all of that being said, I've said this earlier, I'll say it again. I want to challenge all of you. When we go through this content, I think your initial reaction could be to maybe give a side eye, like, really? Do we really have to take it that far? Or is this really necessary? Or your reaction might be, oh, I never thought about it that way. But I really want to encourage all of you to just keep an open mind and give it a try. These are, again, these are terms that I've worked with people from multiple different groups to ensure that, is this perception real? Could this word be perceived as non-inclusive? And the answers that I got were resoundingly yes. And so I'm going to present you with, first of all, terminology that's been grouped into some different categories that might be perceived by various groups as non-inclusive. I'll then explain the rationale for why, and then I'll suggest an alternative or maybe some alternatives for each one. And so again, think about, like, what could I do differently? How might I adopt some of these into my vocabulary? And also, how can I continue to explore how I can create a culture of inclusivity in my workplace, and also in my personal life, just through the words that I choose. So with that, I'm going to dive in. Here we go. So our first category is in the stereotyping and cultural appropriation category. And I have to admit that the word appropriation, I often misuse it myself. I often say misappropriation, but that is not correct. The term is cultural appropriation. And so for anyone who may not be familiar with the definition of that term, really what it means, it's the inappropriate or even unacknowledged adoption of some element of a culture by members of a different culture. And sometimes this can be controversial when a dominant culture in any given part of the world might adopt that element and sort of claim it as their own. So that's a high-level definition of cultural appropriation. And I think stereotyping, hopefully we're all familiar with that term. So all of the words that I'll present or terms that I'll present here sort of fit into this category. And we're going to start with Scrum Master. And this is often something that people give the side eye to because it's been around for so long, really, since Scrum was formed. Why might Scrum Master be perceived as non-inclusive? At first, you may not even recognize it, and I certainly didn't either. But it was brought to my attention that the term master may be insensitive to people who have experienced or have a connection to slavery. And therefore, well, this is to me a no-brainer. Let's change this one. Let's change how we refer to this role. And so some alternatives could be a Scrum lead or even a team coach. And I will say that in my professional life today, I actually consult for many different clients and I help them along their Agile journey. I am seeing more and more that organizations who are using a Scrum methodology have started to adopt this term Scrum lead for that particular role. The term team coach is, I think, a fairly new idea that actually SAFe, the Scaled Agile framework, recently included in its version 6 upgrade. So rather than calling that role a Scrum Master, they are now known as a team coach. So I found that very interesting. I think SAFe is already trying to get in front of the times and keep that literature up to date. Did I hear a potential comment? No, okay.
Well, this is Diana. It's interesting because as a trained coach, it does mean different things across the coaching profession. And so, again, my point is, I guess I'm a little squeaky wheel. It's about the meaning and explaining the meaning behind what we do. I appreciate this though. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, I agree with you. I also think that the term team coach can be confusing to some because coaching in itself, Agile coaching, is also a profession. It is also in a separate role, especially as I'm designing engagements for my clients. There's a very distinct difference between what the Scrum lead is doing versus what a team coach is doing. So in the SAFe framework, SAFe terminology, that's what they're using. You may choose to use this. You may choose Scrum lead. I see Trish in the chat said, why not Scrum coach? Hey, why not? I think that's a great suggestion. I think the intent here is let's move away from the term master just because of that potential connection to slavery that could be triggering or insensitive to certain groups. The next term is very much in the same vein. So master class, I think there is even an organization, a virtual organization or a website called Master Class where you can sign up and learn from experts on various topics like cooking or gardening. I've never done one myself, but this also, again, uses that term master. And so can we move away from that? Can we start to just shift a little bit in our terminology? Again, you might give a side eye to this one and think, really, like, do we really have to? But I'm going to say, yes, I encourage you to challenge yourself and think about it differently because it can be insensitive. Maybe we can just call it advanced training or expert training versus a master class. moving on to the next one, the term tribe. So what I'm suggesting here is maybe instead of tribe, which can be used to refer to a group of people working together, especially in certain agile methodologies, such as the Spotify model, they use this term. Maybe we can choose to use pod or team. Those are two terms that I hear very often. I don't hear tribe being used a whole lot today, but as you might imagine, this can also be considered insensitive to any indigenous peoples. And so therefore, let's just replace that. And I think this one hopefully is a fairly simple switch for most of us. The next term, and there's 3 here, and I'm also giving a couple of different suggestions. So the terms of ninja, sensei, or dojo, these are all sometimes used. I see them a lot in maybe job postings or job descriptions where an employer is looking for someone who's awesome and really good at what they do. They describe desirable qualities or skills. However, the simple use of these terms by someone who is not from an Asian community or culture could be considered cultural appropriation. It could also reinforce stereotypes about those groups. Again, could. And so therefore, because we want to be inclusive and we want everyone to feel safe, maybe we can simply choose different words to express the level of expertise that we're looking for in job postings or in a candidate or in a role, like whiz, expert, pro, or star. All right, I have a question in the chat. Cultural appropriation is requiring me to change to others. I am not sure how to ask the question, but when to catch it now. Okay. That's a good question. So I think, Dennis, my goal here is to encourage us to simply reframe the way that we think, knowing that there are groups who have different backgrounds than I do, or maybe that you do, and different words can be perceived differently, even if it's an unintentional usage, even if you truly were not even aware. Hopefully this presentation will help make us aware of some of these terms. We can't change others, no, certainly, but we can change ourselves, and our words do matter. And by choosing them intentionally, I think that we can create more inclusive environments. So I hope that that answers your question. It may not be what you're looking for, but happy to chat with you too offline if you want to go into this deeper. It's definitely it can be a very sensitive topic, and I recognize that. And then the last one in this category, this one might be new for some people too, gypsy. So the word gypsy, sometimes in an agile way of working, folks might use this word to describe someone who maybe floats or changes teams, isn't dedicated, so they kind of move around a lot. But really that word is derived from the Roma people. And so a lot of times we hear that word in society, in media. At one point, there was a television show, I think, that is actually degrading and derogatory, and it's intended to poke fun at that lifestyle and people from those groups. And so let's move away from that term. Luckily, I don't hear it very often, but I think it's good to be conscious that it's out there, and we may not even realize that it can be perceived as offensive if used in this way. We can just use butterfly. How many times have we heard a social butterfly? You could be a butterfly to your different teams as well. So it just means that you don't necessarily stick with the same team the whole time. Maybe you have a skill set that is needed in various parts of the organization, and so you go where the work is. All right. So that's it for this category. We're going to move to the next category, and there aren't as many in that one. This one had the most terms in the category. So the next category is about ageism and gender bias. And the first one I'll present to you here. Here's another one that you may not even think of initially. I know I didn't. That could be perceived as non-inclusive and it's grandfathered. So a lot of times when I hear the word grandfathered used, it's really intended to describe some process that's been around for a long time, and therefore any new rules that might come into play don't necessarily apply to perhaps people who started in their job before a certain date. Or another example would be, I have used AT&T since I can remember as my mobile phone carrier. And because I've had it for so long, probably over 20 years, it even says on my bills every month when I read them that I'm grandfathered into a certain usage contract where I have unlimited everything, unlimited minutes, and I don't get throttled if I go over a certain usage. But I think the challenge with this term is that it could maybe be used or implied to mean that certain individuals might be getting special treatment, or even worse, it could be used to mean that they can't keep pace. And so this is a term that I think it can be challenging to recognize right away as, oh yeah, like we can change that. But some options that you have, or maybe you can think of others, maybe pre-authorized, maybe legacied, or even exempt. I think in the AT&T example that I gave, any of those would probably fit. And if we're talking about maybe a workplace rule, exempt could go great. All right, I have another question in the chat. When you're dealing with a sensitive subject, whether the topic you're discussing is offensive and based on the response. I'm so sorry, Bob. Do you want to ask that question? I'm not sure I understand the question. You there, Bob? You on mute?
Yeah, but I don't remember. I don't remember
Okay.
typing this question. I don't know where this came from.
I typed it.
Oh.
Is it appropriate to ask when you're dealing with a sensitive subject whether the topic you're discussing is offensive and proceed with your topic based on the response? I mean, because, you know, I agree that, you know, being sensitive to words that you use within a presentation is important. But I also believe that, you know, you can just as easy get permission, you know, to use the word.
I agree with you that it's always good to ask, you know, is this sensitive? You know, are there certain words or topics that you would prefer not to discuss? I think the more open we can be with each other, the better, as long as we're coming from a place of non-judgment and just seeking to understand, not necessarily justify. You know, recognizing that we all come from different backgrounds, different walks of life, and what I may not find offensive, the next person certainly could. So I guess I would say, to answer your question, I do encourage having that type of open conversation at the beginning, and ask for feedback and say, you know, is there anything that I've said that maybe I could have said differently? And certainly I did that when I was putting together this content, because I wanted to make sure that I was very intentional and chose my words carefully. And even as I'm delivering it right now, I still need to ensure that I am consciously choosing the words that I use, because I recognize that one slip could really, you know, it could ruin my credibility, first of all, but it could also make others feel uncomfortable, unwelcome. And I don't want that. But we are always learning and we are always striving to improve, and myself included. So I hope that helps. All right, sorry, I went back a slide. So we were on grandfathered, and we were talking about pre-authorized, legacied, or exempt. And I encourage too, if anyone has other ideas as we're going through these, of, you know, other suggestions for various terminology, just throw them in the chat, because I certainly can't think of everything, and people have some great ideas out there. All right, the next one is one of my favorites because I'm guilty of it so often, and maybe many of us on this call are too. How many times have you joined a meeting, even in the past week or month, and started it off with, "Hi guys"? Guilty. But maybe I don't even need to spend a lot of time explaining it. Guys really refers to a group of people who identify as male, and not everyone identifies as male, and therefore inherently it is not inclusive. And I have to make a very conscious effort every day, and I still slip and I still use it because it's ingrained in me, and I've used it for most of my adult life. It's just the way that I've always spoken to my friends, even my friends who all identify as female. But it is not inclusive, and so I am consciously trying to change that. And so now if I join a call or a meeting, I might start it off with, "Hi folks, hi team." I also use "Hi friends" because I feel like that sort of breaks down that wall a little bit, and I want to make people feel comfortable. So I'm curious if anyone has other ideas of terms that you could use to address a group of people who may identify with various gender identities. What could we use? Any other ideas besides what I've presented here?
I've heard someone from the South explain this to me. They said, when they say "hi y'all," they're talking to one person, but when they say "hi y'all," it means a group of people.
Oh, I did not know that. Hi everyone, hi group, you all, certainly, y'all. Yeah, now that I live in North Carolina, I definitely hear y'all a lot more than I did growing up in New York State. So yeah, I encourage you to try it with this one. Hopefully this will be one that if you come away with anything tonight, the next time you say, "Hey guys," you're gonna say to yourself, "Ah, I did it." But you can change that. You can immediately recognize your slip and replace it. And that is also a sign of being vulnerable, being willing to fess up, "Hey, I made a mistake. It wasn't intentional. I didn't mean to offend anybody, certainly." But it's sometimes just so ingrained in us that it just comes out. And so let's consciously try to change that by even recognizing when we do slip, correcting ourselves right off the bat. Hi, humans. Yes, exactly. Or, if you're talking to your pets, you can maybe call them your babies. I'm a cat lady, so I call my cats my babies. When I asked that of my parents, and I was told the term was degendered. Do you mean that the word guys doesn't imply gender? Yeah. Yeah, I think I can see why that perception exists or existed. Certainly, it's been used for so long that we really haven't given thought to it. But I think in the world that we live in today, now is the time to give thought to it and to recognize that for people who do not identify as male, they may not feel included in the conversation. So I'm making an effort, and I encourage all of you to also. And the next one is man hours. So this one's also kind of evident, right? Like not everyone identifies as a man. And hopefully this can be an easy one to replace with just hours or worker hours if you need to. Maybe someone else can think of some other examples, but we don't need to put a gender on the number of hours worked or employee labor because it's just not necessary. Effort. Perfect. Yeah. All right. Very good. Thanks for all these suggestions and the questions and the comments. I really do appreciate the conversation, and I hope that you feel that this is a safe space that we can be vulnerable and have the conversation. FTE hours, perfect. All right, next we're going to talk about accessibility. And the first example or term that I'm going to show here is sprint. So if you're familiar with the Scrum methodology, which is one of the methodologies within the Agile framework, sprint really refers to a specific time box. Is generally 2 weeks, sometimes up to 4 weeks, in which a team will commit to complete a certain amount of work. And this word, as you maybe can see by this illustration here, I've got a little icon of a person maybe about to start running a race. You know how when the runners kind of get down to the ground and they're ready to shoot off. So the word sprint, you know, inherently it kind of refers to the physical act of running. But that might be a physical limitation for some of your team members or some people in your life. Not everyone is able to run. I am able to run, but I hate running. So I'm happy to change this term. Maybe we can use instead cycle as in a process or a period of time. Or also iteration is another term that, again, SAFe, again, when they came out with their 6th version, they are now using this term of iteration instead of the word sprint. And I think, again, it's because they're recognizing that, hey, we can update some of these terminologies to be more inclusive. So hopefully that one will stick with you too, if you're working in Scrum. The next term here, I hear this all the time in business. Anytime I'm in a business conversation, if I'm with a marketer or with an executive, everybody talks about, let's go get that low-hanging fruit. And what they're really referring to is, you know, they think that there's something that we could easily achieve. And so you're evoking this image of maybe an apple tree, for example, and maybe there's apples kind of hanging near the bottom, and that, oh, well, we should go for those first because we can reach them, or those are easiest. But here again, this doesn't consider the various physical abilities that may exist among our team members. And so when we evoke that image, you know, to someone who is physically abled, they may not necessarily recognize that that is not inclusive. But if there's a person who is not physically able to reach for something, immediately they might think, oh man, you know, like that's not fair, or that doesn't feel good. So here's one that we can replace with a quick win. I couldn't think of any other replacement options for this one, so I'm curious if folks have other ideas as well. And I'm also seeing, how about episode instead of sprint? Immediate opportunities instead of low-hanging fruit. I like both of those. Episode is one I haven't ever thought about or heard of, but yeah, I could see that working, especially in certain contexts, for sure. And immediate opportunities, yeah. High payoff, low effort, very good. Yes. As long as we're trying not to invoke the physical ability to achieve something, I think that's what we're paying attention to here. I hate to be a pest, but are we going too far with some of this? So yes, that's the challenge, Dennis. Remember I said at the beginning, and I showed that photo of the dog, resist the urge to side eye. Yes, I know that sometimes some of this feels like, really, like, do we have to? Is this really offensive? But I really encourage you to think differently and put yourself in the shoes of someone who may be physically disabled or not able the way that we are, and how it might make them feel if we were to use these words. But also, can we maybe just change the words that we use? Maybe it's not so hard. I know, like I said, with using that word guys, I do struggle with it because it's deeply ingrained in me and I've used it for so long. But for other things, maybe like sprint, yeah, I'm happy to use the word iteration, or low-hanging fruit. Happy to use the word or the term quick win. Why? Because it's 2 words instead of 3. So save myself some effort there. Question. Okay, a sprint is a time-boxed effort to complete a set of predetermined work, correct? An iteration is a single development cycle within a project. So is it correct to use iteration instead of sprint? Great question, Chiranjeev. I also have struggled with that myself. The reason I'm posing it as an alternative is because of the fact that SAFe, or the Scaled Agile Framework, recently adopted it into its vocabulary and replaced sprint with iteration. And that is the 6.0 version. So if anyone is familiar with, version 5.1, which came prior to 6.0, you won't see that yet, but this is a fairly recent change, I believe, that came through in almost a year ago. I think it was December of last year. So we're still trying to get ourselves used to all of that new terminology as well. Bob says, no, treat others like you want to be treated. Yes, treat others as they want to be treated. Absolutely. I think that's a great way to think about it. Put yourself in someone's shoes and just think about what would they feel comfortable with. And we won't always know, and we won't always get it right. And I think it's okay if we don't always get it right, but we should recognize if we do make a mistake, and we should always, again, strive to do better. No one's perfect, but we can certainly try. Did I hear someone come off mute? Do we have any other comments? Is there a DEI glossary? That is a great question. I haven't actually looked into if there's maybe, an official DEI glossary. Maybe there is, or maybe certain organizations probably have their own. Maybe from this discussion tonight, you might want to refer to these slides and maybe treat them as your own personal glossary that you can build upon as you come across other perhaps examples of things that we haven't touched on. And certainly as our society and our business world and our perception of what is inclusivity continues to grow, we will probably be adding to it throughout our lives. But maybe this is a good starting point. And thank you, Dennis, for the comment there. So the next one that I'll cover, this one I think is, wow, this one really hit me when I saw that we were starting to replace the term stand up. Now, this is a tough one because, again, it has been part of the Scrum vernacular for so long, since Scrum existed. Daily stand-up is an event that happens every day. There's a certain prescribed format that happens. And when this term, was formed or intended to represent this meeting, it was because at the time, this was well before everyone used to get together over Zoom. Folks on a team used to get together. They used to stand up around a whiteboard or a chalkboard or a team board of some sort, and they would give an update on what they had completed the day before, what they were going to do today, and whether they had any impediments. And the intention of making it a stand-up is that it was limited to a 15-minute meeting. And it was intended that, okay, this should only take 15 minutes. We can all stand for 15 minutes. But can we? No, not everyone can stand or stand for 15 minutes. And so using that term, this one hits me all the time. Every time I see it, it's kind of a little bit gut-wrenching for me because I think about the people who also might hear it on a regular basis, who physically don't have the ability to stand up or can't stand up for a long time. And so I challenge you to think about what are some alternatives. One that I hear or see used a lot is daily Scrum. And so this is the one that I personally have chosen to adopt into my own vernacular. Huddle is an option. I see a comment that, maybe this isn't appropriate either. And I agree with that. Like there might be contexts where huddle doesn't really work. And again, I don't admit to being perfect nor an expert. So if that doesn't feel appropriate, please don't use it. But you have options. Maybe sync, maybe check in. Maybe there are others that we can think of, but let's try to get away from using daily stand-up. All right, I have one more in this category, and this one is blind spot. So again, if we're talking about, oh, how about just meeting? Yeah, absolutely, it's a meeting. It's also an event. So in Scrum, they originally called different meetings ceremonies because they had a prescribed format and they were critical to being present, but now they're called events. So, hey, we could call it a meeting, we could call it an event, but yeah, we'll get away from the physical implication. And the last one, also in this realm of accessibility and ability or disability, is blind spot. So I feel like this is a little bit similar to low-hanging fruit in a way where, you know, we don't necessarily think about it, but there are folks who are not able to see as well as others. Some may be partially blind, legally blind, fully blind. You know, it doesn't matter, but we don't even know that sometimes for people on our team. You know, I have worked with folks who are considered legally blind and they are still able to get the job done. But if we use the term blind spot, how might that make them feel? And so maybe we can think about gap or pain point. Maybe there's something else that comes to mind as I present this. But really it's used to mean like there's something that we can't see or that we can't perceive, but we can maybe get away from that accessible or ability type of reference. How would you change blind spot from driving? Oh, that's a really good one. I never thought about that. Yeah, when the person is in your blind spot. I don't know. Any suggestions? View. Yeah, maybe you could say they're not in my view or they're hidden from view. Danger spot. Ah, yeah, that's a good one. I know a lot of newer vehicles these days have an indicator on the side mirrors that will sometimes light up if there is a car in that zone. I don't know if there's a name for those, or if maybe they're unfortunately named a blind spot indicator. Oh, their blind spot monitor. There you go. Yeah, so some things, like I said in the beginning, sometimes the literature or even just the general terminology does not keep up with the times. You are blind from seeing them, so that would still be appropriate. Maybe, but we're not necessarily blind. We just can't see them there in that point. But that is a tough one. That's a great, I'm really glad that you posed that challenge to me, because now I'm gonna think about this all night. Like, never thought about that one. But at least in our professional lives, maybe we can replace blind spot with something else. So let's think about that one. All right, the last category that I have for you before I talk about some practical applications is the mental health awareness category. And I'm presenting this one a little bit differently. I'm just trying to keep it interesting with the visuals, but what I'm proposing here is anything that you see with a strike through, let's try to eliminate that and let's try to replace it with maybe something else. So the first one is crazy or insane. I hear these words used a lot, and I believe that when I hear them, especially from folks who might be newer to the workplace or even college aged, they use these words to intend something positive, like, oh, that party was crazy, or that football game was insane, and they're using it to convey that they liked it, that it was good. But I think something that we don't often consider when we hear these words is that they oftentimes can be used to negatively describe people who may struggle with mental health. You know, calling someone crazy or insane can be extremely damaging, and therefore calling an event or even a thing crazy or insane could also evoke a similar response for someone who struggles with mental health. So let's try to replace those words with words that inherently have a positive connotation behind them. Maybe if someone did a great job on their presentation, you could say, "You were so creative," or "Your proposal was so bold." This is not an exhaustive list. Perhaps you can think of others, but I really want to encourage us all not to use words that can intentionally be used to describe someone else in a negative light. It's a tough one because we're used to hearing it intended in a positive way, but it can be really damaging if someone struggles with mental health. Younger people also use dope now, but that may also offend someone. Yeah, dope, I think I hear that used in a positive way too, but it also can be construed negatively. I think dope also has a history of being used to refer to someone who you might perceive has a lesser intelligence. So, you know, if you were to say something like, oh, you're such a dope, well, that's not very nice either. So so maybe we can get away from using dope as well. We won't be keeping up with the cool kids, but we can also help the younger generation start to think differently too. The next one, this one is an interesting one, and it's another one that I come across all the time. In fact, every day, and it's starting to really rub my nerves because I can't believe that we still can't replace this one. But to me, this is a no-brainer. Like I need to replace this one everywhere I go. I'm making it my mission. The word grooming is falling out of favor within Agile methodologies. And the reason is it sometimes can be used to reference personal hygiene. In fact, in the UK, if you use the word grooming, you're often talking about like, you know, shaving your beard or like washing yourself or your hair, whatever. Personal hygiene has that connotation. So, you know, depending on how you're using it, you might offend somebody, but also it's used a lot to refer to predatory practices, in particular against children. So the word or the term a child groomer is someone who might be basically preparing that child to feel safe with them so that they can potentially take advantage of them. So those are two really strong reasons to me why I don't want to use this word anymore. But it's used to refer to, in Agile, the practice of updating, maintaining, prioritizing the backlog. So perhaps we can just simply replace it with refinement. So it used to be called backlog grooming. I'm putting my foot in the ground. I am always forevermore going to refer to it as backlog refinement. And maybe y'all can think of something else too. Refinement to replace grooming is creepy. How about cleanliness? Interesting. I'm curious why you think refinement is creepy. I hadn't thought about that, but I'd love to know more. If you care to come off mute, Trish. No? Okay. And then no-brainer can be offensive to some. Yes, Bob, you're absolutely right. I don't know if you might have caught it. As soon as it started to come out of my mouth, I stopped. I was like, nope, I'm not going to use that because I recognized it right away. I don't want to use that term. That's Gina. Okay. Hi, Gina. So yeah, so I slipped. I said something that might be offensive and I quickly was like, nope, let's go a different direction there. So anyway, refinement. It shall forevermore, at least in my vocabulary, be known as refinement. And I encourage everyone to try to do the same. And the last one is war room. Now, war room actually is a term that is used by the military when we are at war. And it's a place where the generals and the officials gather and they build their strategies and their plans. And so that particular usage of the term, of course, I get it. It makes sense. They are preparing for their war strategy. But what has happened over time is that that term has translated into sometimes our business vernacular. And we may have meeting rooms or spaces that are labeled as war room. I used to work in a workplace that had it labeled there. And that can be very triggering to someone who has experienced that type of event, whether they were personally involved or whether they have family or friends who were involved. So another easy switch, I believe, that we can just eliminate it. We could just call it a collaboration space, a collaboration room, a meeting room, a brainstorming room, But let's try not to evoke that triggering event that may have happened in someone's lives, because that can really change the dynamic of how we're interacting with people who have experienced that. I think instead of refinement based on grooming, I like it better to use something in backlog management. Yeah, that's exactly it, Trish. Yes. All right. So now we've gone through a lot. You have a start at maybe a DEI glossary. We're going to shift gears a little bit. I want us to think about, how do we make this stick? And I struggle every day with this, not just with myself, but with my peers, my clients, the people I interact with. It's not easy, as we've all seen. We've all asked some great questions. We've all been thinking differently already, and we will still slip. It's natural. So there's, I think, two scenarios that you might find yourself in. And the first one I'll present is what I'll call hopefully the ideal scenario of, if you're in an open environment. What do I mean by an open environment? It means that perhaps you are working with a brand new team, so people who have just come together to start working on something. Maybe it's a new organization altogether, like, hey, this is a startup. Maybe it's a company that's been around for a while, but they've just cleaned house and they're starting fresh with a lot of new people. Or maybe it's a company who says, we are going to embrace the Agile mindset. We are going to live by the core values. We are going to, in everything that we do, be Agile. That is what I would call an open environment. So it's a place where these type of conversations and suggestions are welcome. So how do you make these changes stick? My first suggestion is get in front of it early. So as soon as you start working with this new team or new organization, or maybe new people join, have a glossary. The glossary was already suggested on this call. You can create a glossary for your team, maybe for your organization. Maybe if there is one, maybe you can add to it, but list the common terms that your people and your organization has chosen to use for particular events or processes or roles. Also, make sure that if you are going to be giving training on this vocabulary, or even in any Agile processes, that you're using those same terms. So it's one thing to have the glossary, but if when you're delivering a training, you're not necessarily using them, then there's a disconnect. And you want to use that opportunity of training folks early on to really make it stick and make it be reinforceable. So if I were giving a training on, what are the events of Scrum, no one's going to hear me say backlog grooming. I'm not doing it. I'm going to use refinement from the very beginning. And then if I hear grooming being used, I'll tell you what I'll do in just a minute. So the next thing that I suggest, if you're in this open environment and you really want to make it stick, give in the moment feedback. So make a gentle correction. It doesn't have to be, calling someone an idiot. It doesn't have to be, I can't believe that you just did that. It could be, hey, I noticed that you actually said this, but I think maybe you might have meant to say this. A gentle correction in an open environment, in a place where people truly embrace the principles and the values of Agile, can absolutely be welcome. Now, if you're in a closed environment, which we'll talk about in a second, that might not work. So remember, consider your environment, consider the culture that you're currently engaged in if you were to use that tactic. And then lastly, be a role model. If you slip up, you can correct yourself immediately on the bat. And I hope that for all of you tonight, that I was a role model, because I slipped up when I started to say no brainer. And I immediately realized that that probably wasn't the best choice. Now, I didn't correct myself, but Bob gave me a gentle correction, or maybe it was Gina, and I acknowledged that. And I think when we acknowledge our mistakes, we give others permission to fail as well. Failure is going to happen. Missteps are going to happen. How do we react to those? How do we learn and grow from those? I think is what really matters. So that's the ideal scenario. Now, what if you're in a closed environment? How do you make these changes, these new vocabulary words stick if you're working in a place that has the, well, this is how we've always done things mentality? So people are really resistant to change and they're kind of set in their ways. This is a challenge. So my first recommendation is don't force it. So you as an individual can consciously choose the words that you use. So I'm going to talk about refinement again. I work in an environment today where I constantly hear the word grooming. And there are certain individuals who have a closed mentality, and I have to be conscious about my interactions with them. I do not want to come across as someone who, considers herself high and mighty above everybody else, and you need to use refinement instead of grooming because XYZ. Because guess what? In a closed environment, that is not going to work. But when I am referring to that practice of maintaining the backlog, I use the word refinement. And guess what? Everyone knows what I mean. And if they don't know what I mean, they would ask me and I would tell them, oh, yeah, it's just the practice of maintaining the backlog. I might even do the next thing, which is explain my thinking. So I could say, I just choose to use that word instead because here's why. And then I would give the rationale. So I'm not forcing it. I'm just explaining this is why I choose to use that word. I'm not telling you that you have to do it, but this is my reasoning. And then lastly, my recommendation is go slow and steady. We've talked about how change is not easy. It cannot happen right away. We will always continue to slip up and make mistakes, maybe subconsciously. So you can't expect it to just switch overnight, especially in a closed environment. Have some patience, have some grace, but be that role model and just be the champion of encouraging others to just think differently and put yourself in other people's shoes. Last but not least, I really want to talk about why overall should we care? And hopefully you're already coming away with some thoughts about why we should care. I think in a nutshell, when we talk to people, when we're dealing with people in our professional lives or in our personal lives, we're going to find that we have better relationships with them when they feel comfortable and when we feel comfortable. And so by using language that is inclusive, by using language that makes people feel included, I think your relationships are going to be stronger. And here are some statistics that I found on LinkedIn, and there's a link to the article as well coming up here. So a study found that 76% of employees and job seekers said diversity was important when considering job offers. So think about that for a second. If you are in a position to hire, or even in a position to influence hiring or recommend positions to others, people actually do care. They want to work in a place that is diverse and that is open because everyone, again, comes from a different background. So when you are working somewhere where diversity is welcome and you can have these open conversations, you inherently will also feel safe. Next, this same study also found that 60% of employees, they want to hear their business leaders speak up on diversity issues. So how many town halls or, group calls have you been on where the leader will talk about the business elements, but do they talk about DEI? Do they talk about maybe some of the softer skills, different things that the organization is doing to strengthen its culture? Well, if they're not, maybe they should be, because this is something that people actually do care about. Also, 80% of people who responded to this survey said that they want to work for a company that values DEI issues. And I think that the previous 2 points here really speak to that as well. And it all comes down to really feeling safe, feeling like you can work somewhere where you'll be included. And then lastly, here's an interesting one. Posts on LinkedIn about diversity, according to this study, got almost 2 times the engagement of other posts. So if you were to post something, about a DEI initiative within your organization versus posting about, I don't know, your recent quarterly targets and whether you reached them or not, maybe your DEI post would actually get more attention. People are looking, people care, people do pay attention to this stuff. And so overall, what I think is that if people feel included, if we're in a place that values diversity, more than likely what you'll start to see is that you have less turnover. People aren't leaving when they feel valued and when they feel included. What does that mean? Well, if they're not turning over, they're going to be staying around a long time. You're going to have a stronger team. When teams are persistent, meaning the people don't swap in and out a lot, when teams really stick together, they form a bond and they have deep-seated knowledge about your company's objectives and your business and your products. And they're going to actually build products that are better and stronger. They're going to deliver better results. So that's the next thing, because your teams are actually there for a long time. They know these products, they have that knowledge. You're going to see those outcomes come through on your bottom line. So that, my friends, is why I think this is so important. And maybe you have other reasons why you think that this is important too. I would love to hear them. I would also I'm going to ask you a couple of just open-ended questions if anyone wants to come off mute or answer them in the chat. One question I have for you is, what is something that you've learned that you will try to adjust in your own vernacular from this conversation? That's one question. What's something that you think you can maybe implement right away? Another question I have is, what's something you want to learn more about? Maybe something sparked your interest and you want to dig in deeper. And lastly, what other ideas do you have? Maybe something we didn't talk about, but that you think, hey, maybe we could try this. So open floor, curious to hear your thoughts.
This is Bob. For me, I know that I use the term guys a lot. So I really, I use folks too, but, I think of guys, like was said earlier, when I use it, I'm thinking from my perspective, I'm talking about just the audience, right? But from their perspective, some people may get offended. So I just need to continually work on that.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing and recognizing that. That's a great sign of a leader, is when you can be vulnerable and say what you want to work on. Thank you, Bob.
Thanks. I also put some, maybe they'll be viewed as funny things in the chat, but some other things like, should we have MasterCard change their name? Because it says MasterCard. And then I think we use tribal knowledge a lot, and I know I use it too, but maybe a better term would be tacit knowledge, though a lot of people don't understand what the word tacit means. But, it would take a while for people to get used to understanding that, but it gets away from the word tribe or tribal.
Yeah.
And then I love watching American Ninja Warrior. I think they might have to call themselves something different. When I first heard about the show, I thought there's going to be like knives and swords and fight to the death. But, now I'm kind of hooked on watching it. But, now that you mentioned ninja, I'm thinking, hey, that could be offensive to some people.
Yeah, you're right.
And then the NFL team, a number of sports teams have changed their name. But the Redskins, who were long-standing, always thought of as the Washington Redskins, they're now called the Washington Commanders. So it's definitely happening out there.
Yeah, you're right. And then Dennis said, oh, the Commanders are now thinking about going back. Oh, I didn't know that. Interesting.
I think the presentation was exceptionally exceptional, excuse me, because I think that
we have, as I tried to mention in the chat, we have become complacent about the way we speak to each other at work or any place. I mean, it's become acceptable, so we've just kind of accepted it. But I think it creates a better environment, as your statistics have shown, when you do have a certain respect for people by respecting the way that you communicate and the words that you use in your communication. So I think it's well received by me anyway, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Gina. I appreciate that too.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else have any final thoughts? Otherwise, there's a really fun quiz I prepared for you, so I can't wait to see who's paying attention.
And another thing I want to say is, during these meetings, my mind is going to come back to the session when those, like the Scrum Masters and all those terms that we now use in the environment, it's going to come back to me to see if I can think of another word to use than the word that is being used.
I'm really glad. That was my hope, is that at least next time you hear one of these, maybe you'll think, oh yeah. All right, so I think we'll move to the quiz, because I think we're coming up on the end of our time here. I do want to say thank you. I wish I could say it in all of the languages, but thank you all. I do appreciate the openness, the questions, the comments. This is a conversation that we need to have, right? So that we can learn and grow and just foster more inclusivity in our workplace and in our personal lives. So thank you. Let's have a fun quiz.
Can you guys hear me?
Barely.